Good morning and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristen. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering Colonial Park Cemetery, located in Savannah, Georgia. So grab your favorite mug, cozy up, and let's take a dig into history. Considering we've already had an episode this season in Savannah, most listeners might be wondering why we're returning this week. If you've taken a guided tour into Savannah, you're probably saying, of course, you have to do an episode on Colonial Park Cemetery and know why. If you're a bit lost, however, and not familiar with this famous park in the city, be prepared for some fascinating history. Colonial Park was established in 1750 during British rule in Savannah's history, when it was the capital of British Province of Georgia, making it steeped in historical events, hauntings, and Savannah's oldest intact multi-episcopal cemetery. By 1789, almost 40 years after its establishment, it had expanded over 3 times its size due to being Savannah's primary public cemetery, but it's no longer active, ending intermits in 1853. Throughout its 103 years, the cemetery had various name changes, including Old Cemetery, Old Brick Graveyard, South Broad Street Cemetery, and Christchurch Cemetery. It's estimated to contain over 9,000 souls within or even more around its undefined grounds. The cemetery prior to its establishment wasn't farms, but had a very different purpose for locals as the city's earliest dueling ground. Just in case for some listeners who might not know, dueling was a formal prearranged form of combat between two people, armed with an agreed weapon of the party's choosing. This was used to resolve conflicts, offenses, and actions between people, ideas, or forces, a pretty standard occurrence through history. However, in Savannah, it was so common the governor had to enact a law forbidding dueling, ending its heyday. Back in the day, Colonial Park was located not in the city center, but outside the city limits, thus an ideal place for duels. Not much other history is known about the dueling grounds, but it's definitely a great setup for hauntings if one could ask for a setup. The cemetery was originally started as the old burial ground for Christchurch Parish for its first years, but in 1789 welcomed all denominations from the city. It holds many of Savannah's first settlers and original residents, prior to Bonaventure and Laurel Grove's established splendors. The cemetery holds a place of remembrance for one of Savannah's darkest moments in history, the yellow fever epidemic of 1820. The outbreak is believed to have been started from an Irish immigrant ship arriving in 1819 to Savannah. Back in the day, these many coastal cities experienced incurable outbreaks from ships with sick passengers that would claim an unimaginable number of souls rapidly. Savannah in 1820 saw the yellow fever claim many of its residents, the city's population going from 7,500 to only 1,500 in the short matter of months. The epidemic not only causing death within the city, but terror and economic disruption. Residents would flee the city life looking for refuge elsewhere, but at times unknowingly would bring it with them. A mass grave containing what's to believe 700 souls is marked within Colonial Park Cemetery. The exact number is said to really be 666, but the numbers association and meaning cause it to be changed to around 700. During its fall season, tourists can find places like Davenport House in Savannah hosting their annual Yellow Fever performance in October up till Halloween, letting tourists learn more about the epidemic, how doctors attempted to cure patients, and just how scary these outbreaks were back in their times. Lit by nothing but candlelight, the museum's efforts to intertwine creepy yet an educational moment are perfectly done, haunting its guests into retelling their experience and causing others to visit as well. Oddly, this cemetery doesn't have any Confederate soldiers within, something that might confuse visitors. This was due to the grounds closing its gates 8 years prior in 1853 to the start of the American Civil War. Wars, no matter how small, touched even the smallest of places and cities, with Colonial Park Cemetery having its scars itself. Visitors strolling through the grounds will notice mismatching dates on headstones and some living for thousands of years. Why, though? Unlike many other cities during the Civil War, Savannah was in the path of Union General Sherman's army, who was notorious for burning cities to the ground in his March to the Sea campaign. Sherman's tactic involved little fighting but large scale destruction of military and civilian infrastructure, a systematic policy intended to discourage Confederate states to keep fighting. Savannah surrendered to Sherman's army and somehow remained intact from this policy, saving much of its history and buildings. But instead had the Union Army camping outside the city, directly inside Colonial Park Cemetery. This was a time the cemetery also was without its walls, making it easily accessible to anyone. Bored and armed with a very mischievous sense of humor, soldiers used their bayonets to miscarve dates into headstones, which is why visitors still to this day see odd dates inscribed and vandalized headstones. Colonial Park's history is also intertwined with Bonaventure and Laurel Groves. Many of the Colonial Park's elite, and after being interred in the grounds, saw their remains disinterred to the other famous grounds after they were established. A great example of this is Gaston's tomb, also known as the Stranger's Tomb in Bonaventure. The tomb originally was built and placed within Colonial Park 7 years after prominent Savannah merchant William Gaston's death, but moved in 1873 to Bonaventure. The tomb was originally built and placed within Colonial Park 7 years after prominent Savannah merchant William Gaston's death, but moved in 1873 to Bonaventure. The tomb was originally empty as Gaston was buried in New York's Marble Cemetery in Manhattan, getting its nickname the Stranger's Tomb because it was used as a temporary resting place for visitors in Savannah who died unexpectedly while in the city, until Gaston was finally laid to rest after the request of his nephew William Kerr within. Colonial Park's most famous resident, Button Gwinnett, might not sound familiar to many visitors, but Gwinnett was one of America's founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence. And yes, you did hear me correctly, his first name was Button. He originally was British born, becoming a representative of Georgia to the Continental Congress. His road to becoming a founding father was quite dismal after several failures in business, including a store. Gwinnett was educated and grew up in England, but his business adventures took him across the sea to Jamaica, and eventually he landed in Savannah from his failures. Politically, however, Gwinnett saw success first in local politics, then progressing to state legislator. He first wasn't a huge advocate of colonial rights until his land was involved to be succeeded from Georgia because of the colonial conservatives' response to the events at the time, causing Gwinnett to become a staunch advocate and a founding father, which during his service in the Continental Congress, Gwinnett lost out to McIntosh for the position to lead the 1st Regiment of the Continental Army, which embittered him greatly for the rest of his life. This later on affected his decisions in attempting to undermine McIntosh's leadership while serving as Speaker of the Georgia Assembly and then also on the Assembly's Executive Council. Gwinnett did write Georgia's first state constitution as well in 1777, but this is often overlooked because of his actions against his bitter rival McIntosh. Gwinnett may have first lost to McIntosh, but became the delegate of the Congress from Georgia and the commander-in-chief of Georgia's military, making him his superior, and then he had McIntosh's brother arrested and charged with treason from his bitterness. Gwinnett also ordered McIntosh to invade a British-controlled area of East Florida, but it was a huge failure, causing both men to blame each other for the defeat, and McIntosh to make a public statement that Gwinnett was a scoundrel and lying rascal, which back then was damning to a gentleman and worthy of a duel. Gwinnett then challenged his rival officially to a duel to protect his honor. On May 16th in 1777, the men finally had it out, exchanging pistols on a plantation owned by deposed royal governor James Wright, which Wright should sound familiar, as he's the exact same governor who fled via Bonaventure on episode 3 of Midnight in the Graveyard and Gardens of Bonaventure. The men took their 12 paces and shot, only wounding each other. Gwinnett, however, died of his wounds 3 days later on May 19th. McIntosh was never charged with the murder of Gwinnett and went on to fully recover and live till 1806. Gwinnett's grave is thought to be within Colonial Park Cemetery. A large grand memorial is dedicated to Button Gwinnett within the grounds, but no headstone. The memorial reading are believed to lie entombed under here, but no one is exactly certain. Years later, collectors have made Gwynette's signature one of the most sought after of the founding fathers, with only 51 known existing examples. His early death and obscure life prior to the signing of the Declaration has increased its value. In 1927, a letter he signed sold for $51,000, and then in 1979, a receipt for a record breaking $100,000 was sold. Much to Gwynette's dismay, his rival in life, Lockman McIntosh, is also a permanent resident of Colonial Park Cemetery. An odd but interesting tale of the past residents of Colonial Park is Nathaniel Greene. Greene was George Washington's most talented and dependable officers and general, and is known for his successful command in the Southern theater on the conflict. Nathaniel was originally born in Rhode Island, coming from a prosperous Quaker and merchant farmer family. Due to their faith, their father discouraged learning from books, dancing, and many other activities. Somehow, Nathaniel convinced his father to hire a tutor and thus had a formal education. Greene famously had a limp that he developed during childhood, which led him to not be selected as an officer for the Rhode Island militia. He unsurprisingly drifted away from his Quaker faith, but was more involved with the military organization in the state of Rhode Island. Eventually, Rhode Island Army of Observation was established and Greene was appointed its commander in 1775. After establishing the Continental Army shortly, Greene was appointed as the Brigadier General in the Continental Army, which was a step up from his prior appointment. He famously aided Washington and continuously helped him during the war, being essential in battles and reorganizing departments, establishing supply depots, and attending Washington's council on board meetings, which was very unusual for a person of his position until July of 1777, when he publicly threatened to resign over the appointment of a French officer to the Continental Army, being enraged. Yet he never went through with it and he stayed. Greene had many other strategic battles, military triumph, and ideas that led him to be an essential soldier of Washington's to lead to the ultimate win against the British. After the war, he originally went back to Rhode Island, but due to debts relocated to Savannah, where he settled on one of the plantations awarded to him from the war, Mulberry Grove. He passed away a few years later from sunstroke at 43 years old. Greene hadn't, though, planned for his passing just yet, so his remains were interred at the Grand Vault in Colonial Park Cemetery in Savannah, beside John Maitland, his arch rival in the conflict. It was until over a century later, in 1902, that his remains were finally moved to a monument in Savannah's Johnson Square. Another well-known Savannah resident within Colonial Park is William Scarsborough. Not many might be familiar with Scarsborough outside Savannah. He was one of the owners of the steamship SS Savannah that in 1819 became the first steamship in the world to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Scarsborough was originally born in South Carolina, educated in Edinburgh, Scotland, and then went on to live in Savannah, Georgia. Becoming a bank director, election manager, member of the Board of Health, was on the Vice Council of Denmark and Sweden, and was on the Council General of Russia. Scarsborough passed away in 1838 while in New York City with his son-in-law Godfrey Bardsley. He and his wife Julia are both buried next to each other in Colonial Park. Colonial Park Cemetery is also home to the most sought-after miniaturist of his day, Edward Green Marlborough. Marlborough was an American painter born in Newport, Rhode Island, who heavily influenced artists, including Charles Fraser, William Dunlap, and John Wesley Jarvis during his time. He began painting at 17, going on to work in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and as far as London. Marlborough's health, however, continually failed him, leading him in an attempt to recover his health in Jamaica. Yet with no luck, he headed to Savannah to visit his cousin Robert McKay and passed away. Marlborough died from tuberculosis, or what was known as consumption, during his time. Many entering the gate in Colonial Park might take pause to wonder why in the middle of its main brick has a DAR at the top. Standing for the Daughters of the American Revolution, the main gate was erected in 1913. This was to memorialize the Revolutionary War veterans buried within the grounds, such as Samuel Elbert, Revolutionary War soldier and Governor of Georgia, Lackland McIntosh, Major General of the Continental Army, Joseph Clay Major in Georgia Line, Revolutionary War, and others like Butwin Gwinnett. Visitors and tourists to the city of Savannah will most commonly hear guides or locals joke it's built on the dead, yet they're not really joking at all. Records of burial grounds are far and few, and memory doesn't seem to be great of what's below. Construction sites are known for accidentally finding bones and grave sites around Savannah. Colonial Park's ending isn't actually where its brick walls are found, and many times additions or forgotten plots are rediscovered. In its past, Colonial Park saw its fair share of proposals to be paved over or railroad built on it, or just threatened its existence in general. Luckily, in 1896, the Park and Tree Commission began to care for the grounds, and in 1967, the Trustees Garden Club undertook a significant restoration of the cemetery. Finally, in 1990, Savannah began a preservation project to maintain Colonial Cemetery for future generations, leading to historical research of its 250 plus years of history. Yet, with all its history and sayings of being built on the dead, we still haven't discussed one haunting yet. Colonial Park Cemetery, first and foremost as a southern cemetery with its mossy oak trees, has its enchanting charms, but also its hoodoo ties. This place absolutely appears haunted to the eye. The cemetery is also a well known location for the practitioners of hoodoo to obtain gopher dirt or cemetery dirt for their spells. This has led to the cemetery to take proactive measures installing hidden cameras and adding gates to deter practitioners stealing its dirt, which might seem an odd occurrence for some unfamiliar with hoodoo customs. But what are the ghosts? Famously in 2008, caught accidentally on camera, was one of the most well-known spirits ever captured, the Jumping Boy. The video catches a small child chasing after a visitor in the cemetery. What's unusual about the video is the child jumps straight into a tree unnaturally outside the normal jumping distance, then mysteriously drops back down moments later. Since its debut, the video has been debunked, but claims of the jumping boy still occur within. However, most tourists can be found strolling the grounds looking for an extremely tall 7-foot man who goes by the name of Rene Rondier. He's claimed to be the murderer of one or more young girls in the city of Savannah. Many ghost tours retell the tragic tale of Rondier. Starting when he was a child, he became known for snapping the necks of small animals in town. Yet Rondier would regret his actions later in life, when a young girl was discovered in Savannah with her neck snapped. The city assumed it was Rondier, and he was then chased down and hung from a tree within Colonial Park's grounds. Some say you can see Rondier strolling through the grounds or hung from a tree near the south end of the cemetery. However, no evidence of these claims have ever been found. When many are within, they claim to see shadowy figures, hear voices, and an unexplained eerie green mist that's been seen gently floating over the headstones. Many believe the cemetery's past as a dueling ground where countless men died to be the main ingredient of the hauntings. We may never know for sure, but for now, visitors strolling through Colonial Park's gates can enjoy its peace, beauty, and the past with its scars carved in the headstones of its Civil War past. But if you do hear a gunshot, I'd duck just in case. The grave grind for Colonial Park Cemetery was an iced peach cobbler latte from Franklin's. For more honorary grinds in the area, please visit the-grim.com. For now, we're closing the gate on Colonial Park Cemetery. We hope you enjoyed our dig into history. If you did, subscribe today to join us next time when we open the gate on the Grim.